Hey, welcome everyone to the second part of an introduction to the Way of Mastery for students. It's really focusing, the second part will focus on the material itself. The first part was more of the history of the pathway and how students find it in the world. There are various people publishing it and so on. And it doesn't hurt to have a little history to start with. But now we're going to get actually into the material. Now, I've shared many times now that it's really important not to go past the way of the heart prior to completing the way of the heart. And that would ideally mean studying each lesson for a month. That's the way the original students studied it. There was an original group of students that were given the audio recordings, one per month for the year. And some of the exercises will say, for 30 days, do this. And so obviously that requires a month. So to do some of the lessons properly, you need to have the full month. And just why not follow it and pursue it the way that Joshua described and prescribed it to be studied. Again, I won't keep going into this. People, you've probably heard this before, so my little lecture is complete on that. So in other words, for this video, when I talk about the material, I'm obviously not going to be talking about anything in the formal teachings of Way of Mastery past the way of the heart. You probably know by now from the previous video, there are 5 core texts to the Way of Mastery: the Jeshua letters and the Way of the Servant, which are not part of the kind of, there's a curriculum which actually involves exercises and homework and things like that. That curriculum is 3 of those 5 books. And those 3 are called the Way of the Heart, the Way of Transformation, and the Way of Knowing. The formal lessons. They're sometimes called the Christ Mind Trilogy. So I'm just going to start talking a little bit about studentship in the Way of the Heart. Now, Joshua shares a couple things about how it's good to have a journal. When you come across a line that kind of you feel an impact from, write it down, repeat it to yourself regularly. And also before listening to the material, reading the material, I think ideally it would be both. Having a book is pretty much essential to the study, but nice to listen to the videos as well. And as we go into the Way of the Heart, I'll just give a little bit of a summary of some of the instructional aspects of it. A little theological summary, which you'll find, and I don't think it sort of sharing a bit of it ahead of time is going to spoil anything or be inappropriate in terms of order. Now, Joshua begins with something which is very similar to a teaching in the Course in Miracles. Nothing is happening to you, everything coming to you at your own request. Nothing can happen to the child of God against his or her will. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the first axiom of the Way of Mastery, there are 2 first axioms. The central, most powerful first axiom, the one that all the teachings are based on, is I and I alone am doing this. The freedom that God has given me means that literally everything I'm experiencing is an aspect of what I've chosen, specifically what I've chosen to put my attention on. And obviously all of these ideas are expanded upon both in terms of greater discussion, but also exercises that help you experience it throughout the Way of the Heart, the 12 lessons of the Way of the Heart. The second axiom, which some of you may know from the Course in Miracles, is I need do nothing. Because how can you be free if you're obliged to do certain things? You need do nothing. There's also a beautiful description about the nature of the dream of separation, how it was created. Not some mistake that occurred as a tiny mad idea crept in from outside, but rather something coming out of an intentional act within the mind of God, the mind of God's child. And the practice, it's a beautiful section in the Lessons of Way of the Heart, where he says that there needed to be a disciplined practice of putting one's attention on the wrong voice. Like learning to play the piano, you have to practice in order to become a master. Well, in order for us to generate the experiences we choose to experience, often we need to practice as well. Joshua gets on in lesson 3 of the Way of the Heart. He goes into a deep dive on the question of forgiveness and how forgiveness is really the key to all of it. It's the presence of God's love in this world. It's also the main corrective for the mind, which has become lost in this this mess, this thing that we've created. It's a beautiful section in the Way of the Heart. It says, you need to get to the point of realizing you've created quite a mess with your consciousness, that you don't know how to get out of it, and therefore you need help. You need to surrender to some other form of help. Fascinating stuff. And a deep dive into forgiveness in Lesson 3, and then into the keys to the kingdom. The keys to the kingdom in the Way of Mastery are desire, intention, allowance, and surrender. Now, I think that that's all that's appropriate to share ahead of time. You'll discover all these things, both, again, in terms of ideas, but more importantly, in terms of the experiences that come from actually practicing the exercises literally as they are given. So one thing I strongly recommend in terms of going through, you've got this journal that you're going to be using for activating sentences or things that seem particularly interesting to you, write down and ponder. But also, please, at the end of each lesson, write down word for word, I would suggest, each exercise, because that's the homework for the month. A lot of people don't like homework, but again, like if you're studying for any other important thing, like if you get a degree in whatever it is, a lot of the time people will be willing to go to school and do all this kind of gyrations and meaningless schoolwork because they're getting a grade or a degree or something. But I would just submit that the spiritual path is more important than any of that. So maybe just, maybe a little willingness to do a little homework here and there is a good thing. Kind of making that commitment at the outset. Oh, some of this will feel like work. But it's also beautiful and extraordinary. Now, in terms of study, there's often this desire to dive in and get as much as you can out of the material as soon as you discover it. And that's why it's so important to kind of have the brakes on and say, yeah, that's great, terrific, go ahead and dive in, but dive into your monthly practice of the Way of the Heart. Dive into reading the lesson again. Dive into being really sure you're getting each month, experiencing the lessons from each month fully. Now, fortunately, for those who are fascinated by the material, I have to say that I've never heard channeled material that is on par with it. And I'm a 30-year course student, and I've read all this. Many of you have probably heard all these other things from Tom Carpenter to they're just many of them. Course in Love and many other things out there. The teachers of A Course in Miracles, and of course the material itself, of course, but many other channels that are out there channeling Jeshua, and some of them are very beautiful. Gina Lake, and I can't think of the gal who does Oak Ridge University at the moment, but I don't know why her slipping my mind, but there are many channels out there who do beautiful work. Brent Haskell was a favorite of mine. He did a book called Journey Beyond Words and the Other Voice. So there are a lot of channels out there, but for me, there's nothing that really matches the frequency and I think the comprehensive philosophy and theology that the Way of Mastery presents. Each one has its own use and its own purpose. Not for me to say, just a personal testimony that these teachings have a unique resonant power. So when you're interested, and if you become a student, you say, I just really want to learn more about this, I want to hear more, that's okay, but not, so don't go forward in the Way of the Heart, Way of Transformation, Way of Knowing, but it is absolutely okay to dive into a huge other section of the channeled material, which aren't part of the 5 core texts, but there is an enormous amount of material in what are now called the early years channelings, the early years. So there are perhaps 24 hour and a half long sections, and they're christmind.info. You can listen to all of them for free, which is wonderful. And there are many of them on Audio Enlightenment, many of them on the Way of Mastery YouTube channel, and so on. But there are things called Death and Earth Changes, It is a channeling that was given in the mid-1990s, in which Jeshua basically predicts a lot of what's happening now. There's Walk With Me, in which of all the different stories there are about Jesus' life, Jeshua's life, this is the one that resonates most strongly for me. There was a book that was published a while ago by a woman named Tricia McCannon, in which she actually did new research with information from the Vatican, and fascinating book, the explosive story of the lost 30 years and the mystery schools about Jesus. I think that's the title. Tricia McCannon. And anyhow, in it, she has a very detailed timeline of his life, which corresponds almost identically to Walk With Me. Walk With Me is a bit more abbreviated, but so just a fascinating one. Walk With Me is a wonderful one. The Divine Feminine, or the Feminine Christ, they're named different things depending on who's releasing them. The Holy Spirit, listening to the Holy Spirit, Holy Relationship. There are many different early years recordings, and if you want to hear more of the material and get a deeper, just more immersion into the material, don't go to the Christ Mind trilogy for that. Go to the early years for that. For just a little personal story, I first met the channel for the Way of Mastery and first saw Jeshua channel in 1995, November 1995. The Christ Mind trilogy was still being channeled at that time. And I saw the book, the Jeshua Letters, and the channel jam was with a picture of him in the back, and I was thinking, well, this just sounds like kind of a ripoff of Course in Miracles. But in the Jeshua Letters, which is a story about Jeshua appearing to him and the beginning of the communication which would form the entire Way of Mastery, the resonance of the channelings that are in the book, the earliest channelings are in that book, just floored me right away as soon as I started reading them. They felt as deep as A Course in Miracles, but for me, deeper in a more emotional and personal way that I couldn't describe at that time. So anyhow, I called up JM, whose picture was on the back, and there was a phone number there because it said private sessions are now available with Jeshua, and in those days that was the case. So I'm thinking, my God, it's like somebody telling me that I could have a reading with Helen Schuckman and Jesus would come through almost. And Helen had been died. The scribe of the Way of Course in Miracles had been gone for a while, and she didn't used to do that anyhow. So I was so activated by this idea that this might happen, I thought, well, I'll call him up. So I call him up, but I was pretty skeptical. I said, are you the real deal, man? And he paused and breathed for a second and said, well, where are you? I'm in Santa Fe. Where are you? And I said, I'm in Lexington, Massachusetts, where I was living at the time. And he said, oh, well, we're going to be in Concord, Massachusetts in 8 days. So why don't you come and see for yourself? So I thought that was this great synchronicity. 8 miles. I guess, they were going to be there in 2 weeks. It was 8 miles from my house. So I went that evening to see him channel in an evening that was recorded and is now known as Love Heals All Things. And it's one of my favorite. If you're a Course in Miracles student, he was talking to a lot of different course students. But it's a magnificently beautiful channeling. And wherever you're starting with the Way of Mastery, I do recommend that, just because of my personal bias. That's when I first saw him and met these teachings. So that's just a short introduction to studying the Way of Mastery. I am planning on creating a study guide which will go through each of the lessons step by step. That will be available at jeshuaspeaks.com. So I've just recorded the first Way of the Heart Lesson 1. I believe there were four 15-minute or so videos for that. So I just read through the material and then comment on the different sections, what you might focus on, just from the perspective of a student. I've been doing this for 25 plus years. And if you're interested in having a guide and something to help you along with the Way of Mastery study, that's going to be there at jeshuaspeaks.com 1 month at a time. I think there are 6 videos in lesson 2 and just continuing on from there. And also, I do private sessions for people, both things that I've grown out of the inquiry processes in Way of Mastery and as a trained yoga teacher, as a course student for a long time, and people seem to find these very, very helpful. So it's all to be, if you're interested in any of this, just check out Jeshua, Jeshua, speaks.com. studentship.com. I'm grateful for the chance, Barry giving me the chance to share here. Really feel that it's wonderful that he's sharing the teachings with so many people, and at the same time making it possible for people to know a little bit more about the studentship and how it's recommended that students approach the material, because that's such an important part of this as well. Wishing you all a happy new year, happy 2023, and thanks for listening. This is David Chalk.